For years, I believed I had built a life wrapped in warmth and trust. I am Evelyn Hart, a writer whose stories have reached readers across America and even into Europe. With each book contract I signed, I thought my future was secure. My red brick townhouse on Appleton Street in Boston was my pride and joy. I bought it for $850,000 after the success of my second novel, a milestone that made me feel both independent and safe. The house had large bay windows that looked out over the quiet street, a narrow staircase with creaking steps, and an attic I had turned into my writing sanctuary. It wasn't just a home. It was proof that hard work and words could give me a foundation of my own. I shared that house with Lucas Quinn. He came into my life during the launch of my first book when everything felt new and dazzling. He had a smile that could smooth the sharp edges of my nerves and a voice that carried a kind of certainty I admired. Lucas often said he loved me for my mind, for the way I could turn emotions into chapters, but he also loved my pancakes. He never failed to remind me of that on Sunday mornings. We created rituals that gave shape to our days. I wrote late into the afternoons while he worked at the kitchen table, running projects I never questioned too closely. We traveled to New York together when I had meetings with my publisher, and sometimes we spent long weekends in Vermont, where we skied or sat near the fire with mugs of cider. Everything about our life together seemed solid, like a story written with a happy ending already promised. That illusion cracked on a rainy night in March. The storm outside was heavy, drumming against the windows and humming through the old walls of the townhouse. I woke to an emptiness beside me. At first, I thought Lucas had gone downstairs for water. I turned over, expecting to fall back asleep, but then I heard his voice. He was speaking low from the hallway outside my study. There was a tone in his words I had never heard before, calculated, sharp, and cold. I was about to call out to him when I heard my own name leave his mouth. My hand froze halfway to the blanket. He was on the phone, speaking to someone he called Claire. He laughed in a way that chilled me, then lowered his voice. He spoke about money. My money, he said. Keep the shell company quiet. Once the advance lands, we move the money, then she'll have nothing. I pressed myself against the darkness, hardly breathing. His words sliced through me like paper cuts too deep to ignore. He listed figures as though reading from my private accounts. He mentioned the UK deal my agent had just closed for £200,000. He spoke about the film option that could bring $1.2 million if the studio exercised it. He knew the numbers down to the cent, and he said them with a greed that made my skin crawl. His plan was clear. He wanted to serve me papers, claim half of everything I had built, and leave me stripped of a security I had worked years to create. In that moment, the air in the hallway seemed to vanish. I felt as though I were floating outside my own body, listening not to my partner, but to a stranger who wore his face. My heart pounded so hard that I feared he might hear it through the door. I slipped back into bed, pulled the covers to my chin, and kept my eyes open until the first pale light of morning touched the windows. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I could not confront him. Not yet. I needed to be careful, to protect myself before the truth surfaced. That morning, I took a long walk along the Charles River. The water was gray and restless, and so was I. Each step along the wet pavement tightened my resolve. When I returned to the townhouse, I sent a single text message to someone I had not spoken to in years. Her name was Naomi Brooks. We had met at a summer writing workshop in Chicago when we were 22. While I chased the uncertain life of a novelist, she had become an attorney in Boston, specializing in corporate and personal asset protection. If anyone could help me build a wall between Lucas and everything I owned, it was Naomi. My message was simple. Can we talk? She called me within a minute. I poured out the story. The phone call, the betrayal, the numbers he had recited as though they belonged to him. She did not gasp or offer pity. She spoke with quiet firmness, saying, "You are going to be careful, and then you are going to be free." Those words steadied me more than anything else could have. That afternoon, I told Lucas I needed space to finish my manuscript and booked a room at a hotel near Beacon Hill. I left my laptop at home, so it wouldn't seem suspicious. Instead, I packed a small bag with a notebook, my phone, and a folder of bank statements. To him, it looked like a writer retreat. To me, it was the first step toward safety. Naomi's office on State Street was lined with degrees, framed verdicts, and photographs of her standing with clients outside courthouses. But what calmed me most was her notepad, where she wrote lists in crisp lines. She took control quickly. "First, we lock the doors on your assets," she said. In one afternoon, she set up a trust in my name to hold the townhouse. She called my agent and rerouted all royalty payments into a new account accessible only to me. She filed notices to freeze any attempted transfers of funds connected to my name. She instructed me to stop responding to Lucas's texts and instead forward everything to her. She explained how to save digital evidence without him noticing. She even reminded me to eat. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension. I moved between the hotel and Naomi's office, careful never to let Lucas suspect I was preparing. He sent messages asking how the draft was going, if I wanted Thai food for dinner when I came home, and if I missed him. I stared at those words and felt both fury and sorrow. The man who had once kissed my forehead before every train ride to New York was now a stranger plotting my ruin. 3 days later, Naomi looked up from her screen with a rare smile. "The fences are ready," she said. Relief spread through me like warmth after frostbite. I paid her a retainer of $25,000 from my emergency fund, money I had set aside for something I had once imagined would be an illness or disaster. In a way, I suppose it was. As I walked back through the streets of Boston that evening, the lamps glowing against the damp pavement, I realized something that tightened my spine. For years, I had written stories about betrayal and resilience, about characters who found strength when the ground crumbled beneath them. Now I was living one of those stories. Only this time, I wasn't writing the plot. I was inside it. And I was determined to make sure the ending belonged to me. For a few weeks, I almost convinced myself that perhaps Lucas had abandoned his plan. He acted like nothing had changed. He brought home peonies from the market on Tremont Street, knowing they were my favorite flowers. He surprised me with Thai takeout when I was too buried in drafts to cook. He touched my shoulder and told me my new chapters carried weight. He kissed my forehead before bed. To anyone looking in from the outside, we still resembled a couple sharing a warm, steady life. But beneath that surface, I had already shifted. I was watching him closely now, seeing the cracks in places where I used to see comfort. Then one evening, he slipped. I had gone out to the grocery store, leaving my laptop open on my desk. When I returned, I noticed the faint glow of the screen, the Messenger app open as though it had been waiting for me to see it. I froze. In the chat thread was his conversation with Claire. His words were blunt. "Her UK money lands next week, then we serve." Her reply was short and cruel, nothing more than a thumbs up followed by, "Burn the brand when you do." I stood in the doorway staring at the words, my chest tightening. I took screenshots quickly, my fingers trembling. Then I emailed them to myself and to Naomi, making sure they could never disappear. When I sent her the images, she wrote back just one word, "Noted." That simple reply steadied me. It was a reminder that I was not alone in this fight, though it still felt like walking through fire. On a warm Friday in April, the next move arrived. A courier knocked on the door, holding a thick envelope. Lucas stood beside me as I opened it, his expression twisted into something between apology and entitlement. "It's only paperwork," he said softly. "We can be adults about this." I unfolded the documents inside. They were divorce papers, though Lucas and I had never even been legally married. Massachusetts recognized common law partnerships in no way, and yet the papers claimed exactly that we were bound as if married, that I had agreed to pool assets, that I owed him half of everything I had earned since the day we met. Worse still, attached to the filing were 2 fabricated emails. They were written in my name, but dripping with phrases I would never use, promising to support him financially while he built a media startup. According to those forgeries, I had pledged to cover his expenses until he succeeded. The demand totaled $1.4 million. I felt my stomach drop. I looked up at him, the man who had shared my bed for 4 years. My voice broke as I asked, Is this who you are? He began to speak, and his words spilled out in waves I barely heard. He claimed he felt small, that standing next to me made him feel invisible. He said he deserved stability after supporting me when my first novel was only a dream. He accused me of having it easy, of never worrying about the bills he claimed to cover. He said I would not even miss the money if I gave it up. I let him talk because his excuses did not matter anymore. What mattered was protecting myself. I told him I had to make a call, stepped onto the porch, and dialed Naomi. She didn't waste a second. You'll serve him back with notice of the trust, she instructed. Show him the royalties are safe, the house is safe, and those emails won't stand. Stay calm, Evelyn. Be clear. I walked back inside, the papers trembling in my hands. I set them on the table and told Lucas the truth. You can't touch the house. The royalties aren't where you think they are. And those emails? They're forgeries. I've hired a digital forensics team to trace them. His shoulders rose and fell like the tide in a storm. His face changed, not guilt, not sorrow, but anger masked by silence. He packed a bag that night and left without a word. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. The following week, Lucas launched a different attack. He turned his focus from my assets to my name. Online, under his own profile and through anonymous accounts, he began posting accusations that I was a plagiarist. He claimed I had stolen passages from a British novelist and from a freelance editor named Maya Reed. He said my success was built on theft, not talent. Within a day, the accusations spread like fire through book blogs and social media threads. By the end of that week, a popular podcast host in New York had mentioned the story, wondering aloud if I was the next literary fraud. My sales plummeted, $40,000 gone in less than 7 days. I could feel my career slipping through my fingers, not because of the truth, but because of a carefully crafted lie. My heart didn't just race. It skipped, stuttered, and struggled to keep up with the weight pressing down on me. On Sunday morning, I met Naomi at her office. She had called in another professional, a crisis PR manager named Tessa Doyle. Tessa had sharp eyes and a sharper tone, the kind of woman who carried solutions in her briefcase like weapons. She spread papers across the table and asked me for receipts, proof of every draft, every email, every edit. I had them. I had always been meticulous. My folders stretched back 10 years, each draft saved in order. My agent had records of every submission, every version, every contract. My editing notes lived in version control with timestamps. I handed it all over, and Tessa smiled grimly. This will help. Naomi arranged for an independent expert to examine the claims. It cost $18,000, but I didn't hesitate. Within a week, the expert delivered a binder thicker than any of my novels. The report was clear. 0 overlap, 0 theft, a clean trail from outline to final copy. It was evidence so strong it could not be ignored. Naomi moved fast. She filed an injunction against Lucas, demanding that he remove the defamatory posts and preserve his devices for review. She sent a formal request for his communications with Claire. Her legal motions stacked up like shields, each one placed firmly between me and the destruction he tried to unleash. Through it all, I felt a strange mix of grief and strength. Grief for the life I thought I had, the love I believed in. Strength because, for the first time, I saw clearly that I could stand without him. The betrayal cut deep, but every paper cut he tried to give me became proof of my resilience. This battle was far from over. But with Naomi at my side and Tessa guarding my reputation, I felt ready. Lucas wanted to strip me bare, to make me doubt my words, my work, my worth. Instead, he had pushed me into a place where I had no choice but to fight. And when a writer fights, she doesn't fight with silence. She fights with evidence, with clarity, with her story. And this story, I knew, was only beginning. The courthouse in Suffolk County stood with a kind of stern dignity, its stone facade catching the light of a June morning that was far too bright for what waited inside. I had not slept the night before. My thoughts turned over like restless pages, each one filled with questions about what Lucas might say, what lies he would try to spin, and how I would stand under the weight of it all. I chose my navy suit for that day, the one my mother had bought me years ago when my very first book deal closed for $120,000. It was more than clothing. It was a reminder of where I had begun, a symbol of how far I had come on my own. As I adjusted the lapels in the mirror, I told myself I had already survived the worst of this story. Today was not about survival. It was about truth. Naomi was waiting for me outside the courtroom doors, calm as ever. She carried her notepad under one arm and wore the quiet confidence of a woman who knew how to wield facts like armor. When I looked at her, I felt sheltered, even if only for a moment. She whispered, "We're ready," and I nodded, though my hands trembled as I clutched my briefcase. Lucas sat at the other table with Claire just behind him, her expression carefully blank, and a lawyer whose tie was dotted with tiny navy anchors. Seeing him there, dressed sharply, his posture poised, was like staring at the ghost of someone I once loved. The man who had shared my bed for 4 years was gone. In his place was a stranger who had reduced me to nothing more than numbers and assets. The proceedings began with the forgery claim. Naomi stood, her voice steady as she introduced our forensics expert, a quiet man from New York who carried no theatrics, only facts. He explained metadata to the judge in simple language, walking through timestamps and IP addresses as if he were guiding us across a bridge. His analysis left no room for doubt. The forged emails had been created on Lucas's own laptop, on a night when Lucas had sworn he was at the gym. To cement the point, Naomi presented security footage from his apartment building, grainy but clear, that showed Lucas at home during the very hours he claimed otherwise. The judge's eyebrow rose slightly as she jotted down notes. Lucas shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. For the first time, I felt a flicker of air in my lungs. Then came the plagiarism smear. Tessa joined Naomi at the table, carrying the thick binder of expert reports that had cost me $18,000 but were worth every cent page by page. She showed the court the analysis. My novels and the accused works did not match in language, structure, or even rhythm. A sworn statement from the British novelist confirmed she had never met me, nor did she believe her work had been stolen. In fact, she had added in her letter, "Ms. Hart's voice is clearly her own, and to suggest otherwise is damaging both to her and to literature itself." As if that weren't enough, Maya Reed, the editor Lucas had tried to use as a weapon, sat in the back row. She rose when called and clarified that she had been hired by Lucas, not by me, to edit a project he never finished. She had no connection to my books. She looked directly at him as she shook her head, her expression filled with quiet disgust. I felt tears burn at the edges of my eyes, but I held them back. This was not the place for tears. This was the place for proof. Naomi closed the presentation with a final piece of defense, the asset fence. She explained to the judge how my townhouse had been transferred into a trust, how my royalty payments were rerouted into secure accounts, and how new agreements with my publisher in New York and an imprint in London had been legally structured to exclude any claims from Lucas. She spoke without flourish, using plain words that carried weight. The judge leaned back, listening carefully, her expression that of a teacher reviewing work she had seen many times before. Lucas's lawyer stood next. He painted me as greedy, calling me a brand rather than a person, insisting I had weaponized the law to keep Lucas from his rightful share. He leaned heavily on words like love and partnership, as though sentiment might soften the hard edges of his case. But when pressed for facts, his arguments unraveled. The emails were proven false. The claims of plagiarism had collapsed. The financial entanglements were shielded by legal walls Naomi had built months before. The judge cut him off gently, but firmly. "Counsel," she said, "I am asking for evidence, not emotion." He had nothing left to offer. In the end, the judge's ruling was precise and firm. The emails were confirmed as forgeries. The defamation posts were deemed reckless and harmful. Lucas was ordered to remove every rumor within 24 hours and to issue a public correction. She set a separate hearing to determine damages, instructing both sides to submit financial records of costs and losses. Naomi handed her a prepared packet, neatly tabbed and organized. It detailed the $286,000 in damages we sought, legal fees, expert costs, PR management, and the verifiable dip in book sales. The judge scanned it briefly and nodded. When the gavel fell, it was not victory I felt, but release. The knot that had tightened in my chest for months began to ease, if only slightly. Lucas turned toward me as the court adjourned, his eyes dark and unreadable. I met his gaze for one fleeting second, then looked away. He no longer deserved my attention. Outside, the air was hot and smelled faintly of sugar from a nearby bakery. Reporters clustered on the courthouse steps, their microphones thrust forward, their questions sharp and eager. "Miss Hart, do you have a comment on the ruling? Did your partner forge the emails himself? How has this affected your writing career?" I paused, the sunlight pressing against me. Then I said simply, "I will let the filings speak for themselves." It was the only answer I could give. Anything more would give him power again, and I refused to hand him a single syllable of my voice. Naomi touched my elbow gently and guided me down the steps, past the cameras and microphones. We walked in silence until the noise faded behind us. I caught my reflection in a courthouse window as we passed. My face looked the same, yet not the same. There were new lines at the edges of my eyes, a new sharpness in my expression. I looked older, but also clearer, as though I had been carved into a stronger version of myself. For the first time, I saw not a woman betrayed, but a woman reshaped. Like a key cut on a grinding wheel, sharper now than it had ever been before. 2 months after the courtroom showdown, I returned once more to face the judge. This time it was for the damages hearing, and though my stomach still tightened at the sight of Lucas seated across the room, I no longer felt the same fear. The evidence had been laid out, the lies torn apart. All that remained was the cost of the destruction he had tried to unleash on my life. The judge's ruling was more than I expected. Lucas was ordered to pay $300,000 in damages, compensation for legal fees, expert reports, PR management, and the proven dip in my book sales. He did not have that kind of money. The court placed a lien on his future earnings, including the so-called media startup he had bragged about but never launched. A protective order was also issued, barring him from contacting me outside of his attorney. Claire's name disappeared from the record, as if she had never existed, and I felt no need to chase her ghost. When it was over, I stepped into the Boston air with Naomi beside me. Relief didn't come as fireworks or a celebration. It came quietly, like the lifting of a weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying on my back. Yet even with the judgment secured, I knew I needed space. I couldn't stay in the Appleton Street townhouse. Not yet. I rented a small apartment in Cambridge, a modest place overlooking a park with a stone fountain that splashed softly, even in the dark. I slept with the windows open, listening to the night sounds of a city. I found a coffee shop a few blocks away, one where nobody recognized my face from the articles or the courtroom photographs. I settled into a leather chair in the corner, its armrest torn from years of use, and I began to write again. For months, my words had been tangled in fear and anger, but in that small apartment, something shifted. The story that had stalled came back to life, though it did not emerge in the form I had planned. My protagonist no longer tiptoed around the people who tried to silence her. She learned instead to read a closed door as an answer, to take rejection as redirection, to name what she wanted without apology. As the pages grew, I realized I was not only writing her story, I was writing myself back into existence. When I felt ready, I returned to the townhouse on Appleton Street. I kept it because it was mine, but I no longer saw it as a place bound to memories of him. Instead, I reshaped it. On the 3rd floor, I created a writing studio with a green velvet sofa and a low table perfect for tea. I framed a map of New England and another of Europe, 2 places where my books had traveled, 2 places that reminded me my voice had crossed oceans. In one corner, I installed a safe. Inside, I placed the trust documents, account information, and a letter to my future self. The letter was short and sharp. You are not easy to break. That fall, my publisher invited me to New York for a strategy meeting. We sat in a high-rise conference room with a view of the Hudson River, and they laid out their plan, repackaging my backlist, pushing the paperback of my latest novel, and offering me a new contract for 2 additional books. The advance was $400,000, spread across 3 years. I said yes, but I negotiated too. I insisted on control of cover design, something I had always wanted, and I asked for a clause that allowed flexibility in the event of legal entanglements. They agreed. We signed the papers with a pen that had a scratch in its clip, and I smiled at its imperfection. It felt right. Not long after, I accepted an invitation to a festival in London. It was my first trip in years, and as I stood on a modest stage answering questions about craft, I realized how far I had come. The audience asked about resilience, about writing through hardship. I told them I had learned to build my life like I build my novels, chapter by chapter, with clear stakes and firm boundaries. I did not speak his name. I did not need to. When I returned to Boston, I invited Naomi to dinner. We cooked pasta in my kitchen, the light from the fixture above casting a soft circle over the table. I handed her a check for $15,000 to keep her on retainer. She tried to refuse, saying I didn't owe her more. I told her it wasn't about owing, it was about peace of mind. Knowing she was still in my corner helped me sleep at night. The damages payment from Lucas came in increments, small and slow, but steady under court order. When the final check arrived, I felt no urge to celebrate. Instead, I divided it carefully. A portion I donated to a legal aid group in Massachusetts that protects women from partners who attempt to drain them through courts and contracts. The rest I placed into a fund I labeled Calm. That was its only purpose. Not travel, not expansion, not investment, just calm. In the quiet months that followed, I relearned the shape of peace. It did not roar or dazzle. It settled. It filled the corners of my townhouse when I opened the windows and let the Boston air roll through the rooms I had bought with my words. It hummed in the sound of the kettle boiling on the stove. It rested in the rhythm of my keys as I typed late into the night, not out of fear, but out of freedom. I know now what I did not know before. Trust can break without warning. Money can slip from under your feet. The story you thought was yours can shatter in the middle of an ordinary night. But strength comes not from preventing betrayal. It comes from what you choose to do when betrayal finds you. I no longer surrender the pen. I no longer share my name with anyone who sees it as a ladder to climb. My home is mine, both in title and in spirit. My work is mine, both in draft and in print. And my life is mine, in all its imperfect, resilient chapters. I stand in my living room now, the afternoon light spilling through the bay windows, and I hear the hum of the city outside. I open the windows wider. The air rushes in, carrying with it the sound of Boston traffic, the bark of a dog, the laughter of children on the sidewalk. The kettle whistles in the kitchen. I breathe deeply, feeling the quiet weight of my own life. And for the first time in a very long while, I am not afraid.